So this is sort of the mopping up operation, the remaining bit of the fourth section of chapter 1, the commodity of capital volume 1. The most exciting stuff is sort of behind us, but there are still a number of points that are worth drawing attention to. The first one where we stopped in the previous installment was where there is a bit of a translation issue. The translation of a rather strange German word that Marx is using here, or rather than using, that Marx is inventing here, is somewhat unhelpful here in the published text, and that was this sentence here. This division of a product into a useful thing and a value becomes practically important. No, sorry, it is the sentence before that. It is only by being exchanged. So this is Marx's emphasis, that labor produces value, but only the act of exchange makes these values actually practically relevant. So they come really into existence only when they are realized in the process of exchange. That is what he's talking about here, and the formulation is a bit opaque. So it is only by being exchanged that the products of labor acquire as values. So they are already values, but they acquire what actually the text says, Wertgegenständlichkeit. That means basically value objecthood or value objectness. So they become actually value objects. So you could say they become sort of objectively as objects values. So they become values not only in an abstract sense, but they become actually concretely values. That's Marx describes that with the word Wertgegenständlichkeit, so like value objectivity or value objectness. This is completely lost here in the translation because the translator just didn't get what this actually non-existent word was supposed to mean here. So in the exchange, the commodities actually become commodities in a certain sense, because, as mentioned before, if I produce something with the intention it to be a commodity, it might still happen that nobody else thinks it is worth being a commodity, and I simply will not be able to sell it, and thereby I don't actually realize the value that is crystallized in this object, and then it is not a value object. That is the idea here. So it is only by being exchanged that the values actually become sort of object-like, distinct from their varied forms of existence as objects of utility, which they are already. So objects of utility, Gebrauchsgegenständlichkeit, they have already being objects of utility, but in the exchange process they also gain a second kind of objecthood, namely the value objecthood. That is the idea here. Indeed, slightly strange, and the translation here is completely misleading. So that is only sort of for the record. So this division of a product into a useful thing and a value becomes practically important only when exchange has acquired such an extension that useful articles are produced for the purpose of being exchanged, and their character as values has therefore to be taken into account beforehand during production. So that is another important additional point here. Commodities and commodity exchange do exist in not modern in societies other than modern capitalist society, but they are of much lesser importance. So only in modern bourgeois capitalist society all this becomes practically important. So all this comes to dominate society as a whole. You remember the formulation that the mode of production, the capitalist mode of production, prevails in our type of society. whereas in pre-modern types of societies or any other types of societies, there might be certain areas of commodity production, but they don't prevail. So that is again this point here emphasized. What else should we look at? Here was again the formulation that the mutual exchangeability of all kinds of useful private labor is an established social fact in this context. The equalization of the most different kinds of labor can be the result only of an abstraction from their inequalities, from how they are not equal. That's basically also a recap in a certain sense. There's more of that coming. The product must be not only useful but useful for others. So that is again the same point. The value that is crystallized in that product, being a product of labor, only becomes actual when others recognize the utility of this thing as useful and therefore are prepared to buy it. So a commodity has to be a use value, and a use value for others, not just for myself. So we had this point before. So if I make a table that I find is extremely useful but nobody else thinks it is, which would probably be the case should I ever be tempted to make a table, then it will most probably not become a commodity because it's not useful. And therefore, because it is not a use value, also its exchange value is basically not gonna materialize. So it doesn't gain that value objecthood that Marx mentioned on the previous page. What else should we mention? So these are all sort of things that are repeated. Basically, we equate different products. Thereby we also equate different kinds of labor of which these products are the products. Then a nice sentence here: we are not aware of this, nevertheless we do it. So all these processes of equation happen all the time. That is what society does. That is part of the dynamic and the structure of society. But we are not necessarily aware of these things, so we are most probably not aware of them. If we would all the time think about them, then we would have an awful lot of thinking to do. So they're basically automatized processes. So they become unconscious, if you like. So they become automatic patterns of behavior in society, and as such, we don't think about them. We are not aware of them. So another nice formulation here in the next sentence. Later on, we try to decipher the hieroglyphics. So the products are hieroglyphics, by which he means basically signs, signs that signify a particular social relation. And we decipher these hieroglyphics to get behind the secret of our own social products. For to stamp an object of utility as a value is just as much a social product as language. So that's a very interesting sort of aside here. Marx takes it for granted. So he's saying that the making of the, if you like, the institution of the commodity, that is a social process. And to illustrate that, he mentions it is as much a social process as the making of the institution of language is a social process. So he takes for granted that we all agree that language is a social fact, which is quite remarkable actually. So that is something you would also find later in Durkheim, and then obviously in structuralist linguistics. So if you remember, or if you're familiar with the structuralist linguistics, that is very much inspired by Durkheimian sociology, but it also resonates with some of the formulations here. But in Marx, these are just sort of thrown in remarks, sort of asides. So he doesn't obviously he doesn't develop these kind of thoughts. But if you read carefully, you can find sort of, if you like, nuclear forms of a lot of modern social theory in sort of throwaway remarks that Marx is making here, like this one about language being a social product. That is quite a remarkable point to make, I think. Quite interesting here, but not central to the argument, of course. So what we don't really need to go through all of this. The character of having value, when once impressed upon products, obtains fixity only by reason of their acting and reacting upon each other as quantities of value. So that is about the relationship between the fact that the products of labor are values and the question of what the quantity of the value, the magnitude of the value is. So these two things, they are sort of separate questions, but they are closely related to each other, because obviously you cannot just have value. If you say something is a value, then you have to ask how much is it, because that is the decisive question there. So for society in practice, it is not important to say that something is a value. The important thing is to say how much value it has, or what the magnitude of it is as a value. So these quantities vary continually, independently of the will, foresight and action of the producers. That brings us back to the sort of starting point of the whole argument, which is the experience in our society that we are subject to structural dynamics over which we don't have any power. And that creates this idea that it is the relations between the things themselves that actually rule over our actions, that rule over our behaviors that constitute society. So basically, this society is the society of the things, much more than the society of us as individual subjects. That's the idea here. To them, their own social action takes the form of the action of objects which rule the producers instead of being ruled by them. That is exactly the argument here. That is sort of a recap of the concept of the fetishism, as explained a few pages before this. And then the restatement of the same thing further down here. In the midst of all the accidental and ever-fluctuating exchange relations between the products, the labor time socially necessary for their production, socially necessary meaning socially on average necessary, forcibly asserts itself like an overriding law of nature. So that is a restatement of the same thing, that it seems that these things have sorted out without our doing anything about it, or without our being able to do anything about it, sort their relationships amongst themselves in the thing world, and the relationships that these things establish between themselves assert themselves like a law of nature. The important thing is, of course, the like an overriding law of nature. Marx is, of course, not suggesting that these are laws of nature, because they are the laws of society. But we experience them the same way we experience actual laws of nature. That's the point here. So in a certain sense, you could say these laws are laws of second nature. It's not actually nature, but it is society being constituted almost as if it was nature all over again. That is another part of the recap. And now here begins a methodological reflection in this paragraph here that begins with man's obviously meaning humans, reflection on the forms of social life, and consequently also his scientific analysis of those forms take a course directly opposite to that of their actual historical development. So here's basically the idea that we theorize something really only at the point when it is more or less completely constituted. And so this we don't need to go into the details of that. Just maybe here this sentence: the categories of bourgeois economy are forms of thought expressing with social validity, so they are valid, the conditions and relations of a definite historically determined mode of production. So what Marx is acknowledging here is that bourgeois economy, so the discipline of political economy, which is a bourgeois discipline, a discipline of bourgeois society's self-reflection, they are valid. So the categories that you learn in the business school, say, or when you do an economics degree, they are not simply false categories. They are valid categories that describe at some level the reality of this particular type of society. But they are not able to explain themselves. They're not able to explain their own possibility, and they're not able to explain the historicity of that particular type of society. Whereby historicity by that I mean both how it comes about and also how it would probably disappear again. So here, which I made a note here, what is this? Oh yes, on the following pages Marx goes through 4 kind of case studies or models of mode of production that are not capitalist commodity production. So that is to make the point that the science that he tries to establish here would be one that puts the capitalist mode of production in perspective by acknowledging that there are others, or there have been others, and there, of course, by implication also could again be others, which he argues bourgeois economic science does not acknowledge, because it generally assumes that the categories of bourgeois society are simply extra-historical categories that are universally valid. So in particular the category of commodity exchange. So economic science, or bourgeois economic science, Marx argues, assumes that commodity exchange relations and everything that comes with it are basically somehow anchored in human nature. And Marx's argument is obviously that this is not the case, because if you study the history of modes of production, you can find there are others, and they produce completely different social relations and also completely different categories of reflection. So how people think about or grasp the type of society that they inhabit. So the first example he takes here, this is all quite tongue-in-cheek and sarcastic. He refers to Robinson Crusoe, because he says that in classical political economy you often find this kind of sort of ideal, typical model, sort of model type argument. What happens if society consists of only one person, which is obviously the situation of Robinson Crusoe, or 2 to be precise, but initially only 1. So he makes fun about this habit of political economists to construct these completely abstract and ideal typical situations that in the case of the example of Robinson Crusoe are obviously fictional, so that they are not even ideal types that relate to any kind of reality. So you know Robinson Crusoe is marooned and soon learns by experience, and having rescued a watch, ledger and pen and ink from the wreck, which is of course funny, commences like a true-born Briton to keep a set of books about himself. So the German text is actually more funny here. So the precise formulation is that Robinson Crusoe keeps book about himself, and Marx seems to think that this is a typically I think in the German text he actually says an Englishman, so a real Englishman. In Marx's opinion, apparently keeps book about himself all the time. So they're very. I don't quite recognize that in modern contemporary society, but in Marx's day, apparently there was an image that English people are extremely sort of systematic and methodical about their the way they go about life, and Marx makes fun of this here. So this is all quite funny. Then the second example of a non-capitalist, obviously if you're marooned on a desert island, whatever it is you do, so the argument here is that that Robinson Crusoe keeps book and thinks about how much time it takes him to make certain things, but this has nothing to do with capitalism, because there's no exchange, because it's just him. So he just likes, because he is English or a true-born Briton, he just likes keeping book about himself and to keep check on how much time he's spending on what. But this has nothing to do with capitalism, of course. So the second example of not capitalism is the European Middle Ages. Here we find serfs and lord, vassals and suzerains, laymen and clergy, etc. So you have this medieval society about which he says personal dependence here characterizes the social relations of production, and that is the contrast to modern capitalist society, where dependence is impersonal. That is one of the key distinctions between pre-modern, in this case European Middle Ages type society, and modern capitalist society, that dependency is not personal as in the case of serfs and lords, but it is impersonal and mediated through these abstract processes of the commodity producing society, as in the case of wage labor. So wage labor is in this respect completely different from the relationship between serf and lord, or slave and master, for that matter, or whatever else. So the last sentence here in this paragraph is useful as a formulation. So he says basically about modern society that the relations are disguised under the shape of social relations between the products of labor. So here he makes it sound as if the appearance that social relations are actually the social relations between things is a disguise. So underneath that disguise, obviously also in our society, social relations are actually relations between people, but they appear in the form of this in this sort of almost like a disguise. They appear as the relationships between things. And then the next case study of not capitalism, that would be a situation where labor is exerted in common or directly associated between people, and the example for that is the patriarchal industry of a peasant family, which he says that we actually find in the present society as well. So that would be an example. You remember in the beginning we have this formulation that the capitalist mode of production prevails. So this would be a mode of production, the patriarchal peasant family industry, that is not the capitalist mode of production, but is sort of subordinated to that mode of production within contemporary society. So they produce things between themselves and in a division of labor and everything, but not as commodities. And then Here's a description. The description goes on how this works. This sentence here: the distribution of the work within the family and the regulation of the labor time of the several members of the family depend as well upon differences of age and sex as upon natural conditions varying with the seasons. So that is completely different, or perhaps not completely different, but it is mostly different from wage labor relations, which are of a much more abstract and sort of universally equal character, and where differences of age and sex are much less relevant. Obviously they are, as we know, not entirely irrelevant, but that is sort of, if you like, it is almost like if wage labor relations are actually influenced by differences of age and sex and whatever else, then there seems to be, if you follow the formulation here, then this would almost be a kind of sort of a pre-capitalist characteristic that sort of spills over into the society of wage labor relations. But it is not really typical of capitalist production, Marx seems to be arguing here. And now the fourth case is very, very briefly hinted at, is one of the very few places in the text, certainly in Capital, but also elsewhere in Marx's writing, where he sort of sketches out a situation. I don't want to call it utopian, but a sort of a rough sketch of a type of society that would be desirable to live in. And he calls this, he describes this in the following way: let us now picture to ourselves a community of free individuals carrying on their work with the means of production in common. So that is basically a description of what Marx would have called communism. So that is, he doesn't actually use the word here, it seems, but that is what he's talking about. Very rare. Very rare that he tries to be sort of the German phrase is Verein freier Menschen, the community of free individuals. Verein is not exactly the same as community. Community has a much more traditionalist sound to it that is typical of the English translation here. In German, Verein is more like association, actually. So the correct translation would probably be an association of free individuals. He doesn't say an awful lot about it. This is very, very short, and then even also kind of slightly strange. We will assume, but merely for the sake of a parallel with the production of commodities, that the share of each individual producer in the means of subsistence is determined by his labor time. There is a very strange and confusing formulation here, because the sentence beginning with "but" indicates that he doesn't actually think that the association of free individuals will be characterized by sharing the means of subsistence somehow being determined by everybody's labor time. So in other words, he argues here, but only for the sake of argument, that in this association of free individuals, people would be given a certain amount of means of subsistence in relation to how much they've been working, which is kind of very strange here. So this is I'm only pointing this out because it is often discussed when people try to figure out what was actually Marx's idea of a good kind of society, and it's the answer is there is very little to go by, and the little there is often also quite contradictory. Like here, it's rather strange that he makes here an argument about something that at the same time he emphasizes is actually not what he thinks is characteristic of that association. And that's it. So there's very, very little about this. He does say, however, that the social relations of the individual producers would be perfectly simple and intelligible. So the main thing that he does emphasize is that they would be transparent. So that would be a type of society where nothing is opaque to such an extent that it would create, as in the fetishism of the commodity, they create the impression that society itself, as a relationship between things, is actually constituting the dynamics and the structures of society, but it would be, because it is transparent and based on some kind of communication between these free individuals, it would be a totally non-mysterious and sort of mundane kind of society without all this, without all the enigmas and mysteries that characterize the capitalist mode of production. Another strange little thing, you see this sentence here: the religious world is but the reflex of the real world. That is actually not in the German text, so this sentence you should actually cross out. That shouldn't be there. This was just made up by the translators. I have no idea why they put this sentence in there, because that is actually a simplification of Marx's point of view. So Marx doesn't have the point of view that religion is somehow a reflection of the real world. So that is a rather crude way of putting it. That is not necessarily Marx's opinion, and it is simply not in the text here at this place. I just wanted to point out to this one thing here, because this might be this argument might be familiar to you from another author, namely from Max Weber. You have that here again as a purely throwaway remark that is not developed any further. He does think that for a society based upon the production of commodities, Christianity is sort of the most fitting form of religion, because Christianity, or he sees Christianity as the cult of abstract man, basically being sort of an individualist religion, or a religion that strongly emphasizes the value of the individual as opposed to maybe an agrarian community or something. And most especially in its bourgeois development, which is Protestantism, and even more especially particular types within the larger tradition of Protestantism, such as deism and so on. So he observes a correlation between the development of the capitalist mode of production and the Reformation and particular types of Protestant Christianity. And he finds them fitting because they create a similar kind of, or a sort of, a fitting, a corresponding idea of human nature and the behavior, the sort of, the nature of human individuality that seems to correspond between, there seems to be a correspondence between the Christian image of man, if you like, and that of capitalism. But this is just in brackets, really. What have we got here? The religious reflex of the real world can, in any case, only then finally vanish. So this is the question: at what point would religion actually disappear from society? And he says here, this can only possibly happen when the practical relations of everyday life become perfectly intelligible and reasonable with regard to people's fellow men and to nature. So he's basically saying that only when this kind of transparent and intelligible and reasonable forms of relations are established, then also religion and mysticism, etc., could basically sort of disappear. It doesn't even necessarily say they will disappear, but they could disappear, which by implication means that as long as this transparent form of society, of the freely associated individuals, doesn't exist, there's basically no chance that religion and mysticisms of all sort, irrational ideas about society could possibly disappear, because they just won't, because social life is non-transparent. And when something is non-transparent, we come up with mystical explanations of why stuff happens, because simply we don't understand that thing which is non-transparent. That's the idea here. So what is this here? Yes, so this is another formulation on the production, or society in which production is done by freely associated men human beings. So the society in the form of a free association. And he says here that would be, that is part of this idea of transparency and reasonableness or rationality, that society would be consciously regulated by these associated individuals in accordance with a settled plan. And again, this is sort of and this is perhaps a good place to stop looking at this chapter, because in the following there's basically more repetition which you can work through in your own time. This is one of the rare places where Marx gives a hint what he would consider a desirable form of society. So that would involve some sort of rational planning of the relations, and of course that includes the production relations between the freely associated individuals in that not yet existing type of society. Okay, thank you very much. That is the last bit from the fourth section, as I said before, fourth section of chapter 1. So chapters 2 and 3 are basically further developing points made in the first chapter, and the next chapter we will look at in more detail is chapter 4, where the concept of capital is introduced. Okay, thank you very much, and I see you next time.